Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings throughout the universe. It's a blessing to have you back for another session of the Digital Media Academy. Now we're getting really into the nuts and bolts of this work. We're talking about today public relations, earned media, the marketing components that we have hit so far, the key marketing components. We could go on forever about all the different aspects of marketing, of course. And then finally, we're going to talk about the baselines of how you understand your organizational data within the data feedback that we've been talking about throughout the course. So let's get into it. So yeah, earned media, of course, is called earned because of how hard it is to get media hits, right? That you really have to do something extraordinary. You really have to have key media relationships. You have to have really important thought leadership, something you're bringing to the mainstream in these times to get covered on these issues, especially when you're working in the Muslim community, when you're working even in faith communities generally right now, right? There's very little reporting that's done on faith in these times. You have like the religion news services, you have some small blogs, even in the Christian community. Then you have of course, Muslim community. The media that does exist is controlled by like a handful of editors around the world in the English language. And so, you have to do something great, but at the same time, you shouldn't leave this component out of your work, even if you're an artist, because you should always try to get media hits, because the return of what you'll get is much greater than the effort that you'll put into writing a simple press release or using a press wire service to get the press release in front of the right people, right? So historically within organizations, of course, and still today, a lot of organizations have PR and earned media at the absolute center of the work. The difficulty of that, of still having PR as like your only component of the work that you're doing, is that now you have huge gaps in audiences, right? A lot of young people never watch television. Like I would like watch television if I was visiting my grandparents. That's a good example of how little we watch local news now, right? We watch local news clips if it has to do with something we really care about, or if it features a story of a friend or something, right? But generally speaking, I can't remember the last time I can remember watching a full 35 minutes of the evening news is just when I visit my family, right? Just when I visit my grandparents. I'm sitting with my grandparents, and that shows the level of gap that exists there. So it's important, and it's important to reach those folk, right? And especially there's a lot of ignorance within elderly generations. And so I'm not saying that don't do PR, but it's going to be such a different audience than everything else that you can get in all of the production elements and social media elements that we've been talking about in the course, that now you have to have this big creative infrastructure looking at how you're producing content all over the place, right? And there's no greater example of this than this little slide that I put together, right? That in 1993, the New York Times was bought by the New York Times bought the Boston Globe for $1.1 billion. In 2013, after the film Spotlight came out, that won the Academy Award for Best Picture that year, that was about a Boston Globe investigation into the Catholic Church and all the sexual abuse scandals that happened there. This was right after they won all those Pulitzer Prizes. They have an Academy Award-winning film, and what newspaper you can think of a few, newspapers who've ever had great films made about them, right? Few and far between. It was sold again right after that for $70 million, right? This is over a period of 20 years that happens. And that level of devaluation that shows, and of course newspapers have shut down around the country. Some towns, some cities don't even have newspapers in the United States anymore. Everyone had to go digital and spend all this money in digital. And that's the only reason those who survive are the ones that are making money in digital now, not the ones that are making money in print, of course. So it shows how much this has shifted in such a short period of time. So again, that's about that idea. I mean, talking about that is really about understanding that's how much the audience has shifted to social media, that pretty much most of us get our news from social media, or now we get our news from news aggregators like Apple News or Google News, right? Or Twitter. We're not really getting our news from the historical traditional sources. And so I say all that, as a caveat to say why you should do PR work, but don't spend all your time doing it, right? And so PR is really about putting your organizational thought leadership forward. PR is driven primarily today by unique stories. So you have to get creative to break into this category, right? That's why it's called earned media. It's often driven by some type of data-driven research. So a lot of organizations will do like annual reports where they'll do like a report about school bullying, and they'll interview all these, it's fairly easy data to gather. You have a survey that you're giving to X amount of Muslim students in schools, as an example, or African-American students or Latino students or whatever, and you're looking at bullying in schools. You put out something like that has those hard data points, it's pretty likely that you'll get coverage. Or if you're doing something about Muslims and mental health, or the decline of mental health, and especially related to the crisis that's happening right now, you're likely to get coverage. The key here really is that you're building your media list, or you can work with an organization like Rethink Media that focuses on Muslim organizations, what they call a MIMSA, Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern, South Asian communities, and they help those organizations run their PR. So you can reach out to them. You can also distribute a press release through lists like PR Web. But if you want to do PR well, you really have to have media relationships. And without that step, it's hard to break into PR, right? But if you call news desks and you talk to people you ask them, would you be interested in a story like this? Generally speaking, if you talk pretty quickly, they will respond to you, and they will give you feedback on whether or not they'd be interested in your story. And then, another difficulty we faced, especially in 2020, is that when you have a news cycle that's just so saturated, obviously in the United States, as an example, this news cycle has been so saturated by COVID and then the presidential election, that breaking into news cycles without stories that are related to those two things is going to be very, very difficult. A lot of groups, of course, have rapid response PR strategies, and some organizations will put out a press release basically for everything. And that rapid response PR would be like, some hate crime happens in the community and you put out a press release about it, or, some organizing issue is going on and they're going to be presenting at the city council. Those types of rapid response PR strategies people are usually pretty responsive to that, the press is, but it has to be timely. And then the other way to do it that a lot of organizations will do is that if you're going to have a big launch of something you're doing, have a press conference. And even if only a couple members of the media come to your press conference, you still go forward with the press conference, right? Because at least you'll get that coverage. But without that press conference where you're announcing what it is that you're doing, it's harder for you also to get the media coverage. So if you're going to do a press release, you also should consider doing a press conference in a key location about something that has to do with whatever it is that you're announcing in your press, and then in your press release. And then do your research before you send your PR to make sure that you're, of course, targeting the right reporters. There's all these databases related to reporters and who's reporting on what. And like I said, with networks like Rethink Media, you can figure out how to access those reporter lists. It's pretty, but like subscribing to those lists is very expensive. So only the large national organizations generally subscribe to those lists. Core components to a press release are really about core messaging is like, what is your story? Does it have a strong headline? Because if you think about it, reporters are going to get hundreds of emails per day. Without that strong headline, it's going to be difficult for them to follow your story, and they may not be interested in it. Like if you're launching a book or an album or something like that, again, you want to make sure that you're targeting the right, they call them desks within the organization. That's like the art department, right? Or the weekend department. And a lot of those unfortunate departments have also really declined with the decline of journalism, but it's still worth targeting those people specifically. You want a quote from your leaders, or your product owners or directors, obviously prominently featured within the press release itself, because oftentimes people may not come to your press conference and they'll just run with that quote from you that's already in the press release. And so you really want to make sure that that quote is reflective of what it is you actually want to say. You should be a press release should be really short and to the point. The classic who, what, where, when, why, where can they find you? You want to make sure that your contact information is at the very top, basically after the headline, so that they can quickly find your email or your phone number. Why is what you're doing important, right? You want to paste the press release into the body of the email. There used to be this practice where people would put a press release as an attachment, but nowadays reporters, of course, aren't downloading attachments because they could be some type of virus that goes onto their computer. So almost no one would download an attachment if you put an attachment within the email. And generally speaking, you shouldn't really expect to hear back from people unless it's a super hot topic. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you call the editorial desks in the morning, because they'll have their editorial meetings around 9 or 10 a.m. where they're deciding on the stories that they're going to be covering that day. And if you call them before that, say, hey, I sent you a press release. I'm just making sure that you all saw it. And then they respond as to whether or not they saw it, whether or not they're interested, and whether or not they'll be discussing it within their editorial meeting. And then that you also have a little bit of time within that window while you're on the phone with them to do a hard pitch. But these people, obviously reporters and editors, are super busy, so they're not going to give you a ton of time. So don't expect to have a ton of time. Speak very quickly, get to your point, and then say thanks so much, and there you go, right? But again, here the key is building those press releases. Building press relationships to really have an opportunity for these doors to open to you. I want to give you a quick example within my own work, right? In the work that we did here at the San Diego Tijuana border with the border mosque, that was work that we started. And the logic of the organization I was working with at the time would be, well, you're doing an event, so you should put a press release out for that event. But I knew that we were making this film about the event, and that the film would allow us to tell the story our own way and in a deeper way. And once this relationship, was in order between the border church and the border mosque, the film that's featured in our film, A Prayer Beyond Borders, we'd have stronger press elements later as the story went on. So we actually waited about 5 months to put out a press release, and we put out the first press release with the release of the film. And I wanted to show you a couple of different media clips from how the story developed, right? And what's unique about this also is that this is a newer logic of how to do press, that if you're doing like a really amazing piece of content now, you can even do a press release around that, and people will cover it because it's newsworthy, right? So let me run a couple of these video clips, and I'll show you some of the different ways that this was covered once we put out the film.
A Christian congregation and an Islamic mosque, they are finding common ground at perhaps the most appropriate spot, Friendship Park at the U.S.-Mexico border. 10 News reporter Natay Holmes reveals the new short film that they're hoping will inspire federal action to keep the park open.
And when we remove the wall from our hearts, our minds, and our souls, we are able to impact the world completely.
A Prayer Beyond Borders. 2 houses of worship put together this short film at our San Diego-Tijuana border.
This is what humanity looks like. This is what humanity looks like.
The park is the only place on the U.S.-Mexico border where families who have been separated by U.S. immigration policies can come together, can physically be together.
Worshippers have been holding prayer there every week since 2011.
Where we can pray together, when we can come together, we can break bread together, and this is exactly what we are doing.
First United Methodist Church and the Islamic Center of San Diego are calling for a day of unity for people of all faiths for the binational day of prayer at Friendship Park on October 27th.
The entire country can turn together to think about those families who've been separated, to think about the injustices happening at our border.
Worshippers say there has been threats to close Friendship Park, but no action was ever taken. They are hoping their continued presence and short film will show federal leaders they need this space open.
Millions of families in the United States and in Mexico have no access to each other at all. So closing Friendship Park would close any possibility of them being able to see each other.
Nate Holmes, 10 News.
So that was obviously the local piece from the San Diego side of the border. That was one of the media hits that we got about the film. And then we were also having this binational day of prayer that we had with Imam Omar Suleiman and others, where then we, of course, put a press release out for that event specifically itself and got some really beautiful photos like on the cover of the San Diego Union Tribune. But then, one of the key strategies here also is that if you live in a big city that has multilingual press, you want to make sure, especially when your issues are pertaining to communities of color, that you reach out to those press outlets as well, because you can actually get very different style of media in terms of the way that they'll tell your story. They might tell more human stories, and even you can send them the English language release, generally speaking, because of course their reporters are going to be bilingual working within the city. If you can get a translation of your press release, that can be helpful. Like we actually, for this release, we put out Spanish and English press releases, and we put out we made a big push within Tijuana, and we had at this specific event, we had way more press on the Tijuana side in Mexico than in San Diego, where we had a photographer and a couple of film crews. On the U.S. side, we had about 20 film crews and like 20 photographers on the Mexican side. And so I want to show you a piece from Mexico that shows a bit of how the story is told in a much different way in the Spanish language and in the Mexican press.
Efrén Fidel tiene tan solo 2 años. Este domingo participó en un momento de oración al lado de su padre y su madre, mexicanos convertidos al Islam.
Todos los días reza con mi esposo, son 5 oraciones, le encanta hacerlo y va y aunque está chiquitito, pero aprende los movimientos y te dice una que otra palabra en árabe. Hace 5 años me convertí al Islam por mi esposo. Y pues es que se siente, es diferente. Yo era católica anteriormente y al encontrar el Islam, no, todo fue muy diferente, muy distinto. Muchas preguntas que yo tenía fueron resueltas.
Alrededor de las 12 del día del domingo, más de 50 familias llegaron al muro en Tijuana para compartir con la comunidad mexicana sus tradiciones, sus creencias y su comida. En el momento de reflexión, algunas personas tomaron el micrófono para comentar sobre el muro y las divisiones humanas.
Porque nosotros estamos unificando que este muro, que ningún muro puede separarnos. Todos pertenecemos a la raza humana. Tu sangre es roja, la mía es roja. No somos diferentes. Si tú eres madre, tú quieres lo mejor para tus hijos. Igualmente yo. Entonces lo que estamos aquí es que sepan quiénes somos y para que sepan que estamos en total solidaridad.
Hace apenas una semana se dio a conocer que la comunidad musulmana en Tijuana, San Diego, construiría un albergue para que las personas que buscan asilo en Estados Unidos puedan tener un lugar donde estar seguros y hacer oración. Por tal motivo, buscan espacios para destruir clichés sobre el origen de los musulmanes y sus costumbres.
Hoy es el Día Binacional donde se están juntando, estamos un imán del otro lado por primera vez del lado de San Diego y nosotros de este lado. Entonces es un día muy especial porque por primera vez va a haber un imán dando una oración en el lado de San Diego y nosotros ya lo hemos hecho aquí, pero es importante que nos unamos frontera con frontera.
It is our duty to overcome manifestations of immorality.
Efren es parte del desarrollo de esta comunidad y muestra cómo sus costumbres son abiertas y empáticas hacia los otros. Para KSDY San Diego 50, Yolanda Morales.
Yeah, that piece actually almost always chokes me up because it's so beautiful that it really, for those of you who don't speak enough Spanish to understand it, it was talking about the little boy at the beginning. It's such a human piece to say, this little boy knows how to pray, and he knows how to pray like his father knows how to pray, how his father taught him. And it's such a beautiful piece of media about Muslims and who we are and why that we're there, and the growing Muslim community in Tijuana, and how, like Sister Nahela said, that our blood, isn't different one from another, despite us being on different sides of that wall. SubhanAllah, that piece always really chokes me up, and that it's about, us praying while we're separated, even though Imam Omar Suleiman was leading the prayer in the U.S. side of the border, which you couldn't see in the video, right? Our hearts weren't separated. And so it's such a powerful piece, and it's so different than, whereas the U.S. piece is very factual and who, what, where, when, why, the Mexican piece is a very human oriented, just powerful piece of media. I love that piece of media. I hope it shows again how different, especially in multilingual settings, how different news entities will cover your story in very different ways. And so then the story continued to develop. We kept bringing very prominent people to the border church and the border mosque gatherings. And then we brought our sister Rashida Tlaib. And what was interesting about that is that we had expected to get some press at the border when we crossed the border with her, a prominent congresswoman visiting Mexico for the first time, going into Tijuana for the first time. She's commenting upon how much the space reminds her of Palestine. And so we expected to get press on the U.S. side, but then there was actually a sister there from Now This who was just researching. She was doing research for a longer documentary that she wanted to do on our work, but then it was so powerful the moment there with Rashida Tlaib that she shot a short video with her iPhone, and Now This, of course, is the largest video platform on Facebook, and so this actually ended up being the biggest story we got that year. Even our own video production was from this short video shot on an iPhone. So I'll let you see that piece real quick now.
Instead of focusing on the American dream, we've created a nightmare for so many families.
I'm here to tell you that I really do feel the incredible emotions as I came through Baja California and to this wall. All I can think about is my dear grandmother in Palestine. This is the same president that separated me from her, and they're doing it to so many of my incredible neighbors.
I'm here to try to understand, and then also to try to be refueled and doing something about it. I think it's really important that many of the people I met here today, that I believe them, that this is wrong, that I believe them and see them and hear them.
We just want people to remember that these walls are inhuman. They are against our faith traditions, and that our faiths believe in bringing people together. It's not about disunity. It's not about nothing in any of our faiths talk about dividing families.
I'm proud to serve in the United States Congress, not only as a woman that grew up in the most beautiful blackest city in the country, in the city of Detroit, but also a proud Palestinian American, child of Palestinian immigrants. And I want you to know that I work really, really hard on your behalf to tear down not only walls in Palestine, but your walls in Mexico.
Usually this is the only place on the U.S.-Mexico border where families who have been separated can meet. It's essentially one of the only places in the world where Muslim and Christian communities literally pray together in service together. It's just really powerful, really beautiful. It's beyond, it's not about dialogue, it's literally just praying for separated families and saving this space known as Friendship Park so families can continue to meet here.
Putting a wall up is not doing anything but causing pain for so many families, and it's really important to connect all these movements, to understand that walls create suffering. It creates so much pain for so many families and children. A young Marine on my team told me about the incredible courage of deported veterans here that have been working to try to talk about the injustice of people, men and women that served our country and adopted our country and served our country and put their lives at stake, were deported, all of it taken away from them.
So we're here to connect our hearts and to remind all of us that we belong together, that we all belong together as humans and as families.
Allahu Akbar.
Yeah, so that was the piece with our sister Rashida. But you know, and as beautiful as that piece was, we still produced our own video that day as well, because we wanted to make sure that we showed this moment, right? That we showed this moment that now this didn't cover, where a congresswoman whose life has been threatened in the United States by white supremacist Christians was prayed for by this Mexican and American congregation called the Border Church. They prayed over her, and you know, we as the Muslim community prayed for her as well. And that piece, you know, we made our own video that had that moment captured in it. This is the photo that really captures that moment powerfully. We made sure that we made that as well to not miss one of the most important aspects of the story. And we didn't know we were going to get the Now This coverage also, so we had hired a videography team, and we made another short film with them that day. You know, and so using this very diverse set of strategies for the launch of the Border Mosque initiative, the Border Mosque and the Border Church initiative, and our film A Prayer Beyond Borders led to this level of global press, right? We had hundreds of press hits around the world. And it really amplified this faith-oriented story that talks about how unjust it is, to separate families. It's always been about family separation for all of us in the work that we were doing, but also that it featured our work that we were doing in creating this community together in the borderlands, right? So yeah, so that's it for this part about PR. In the next video, I'll talk more in depth about marketing, inshallah.